Welcome everyone to our Why You Should Use Channels Instead of Chat. Would really appreciate you joining the business user groups from Sydney and Melbourne for Engage Squared and Microsoft 365, and also SWOOP Analytics customers and prospects far and wide. We appreciate you all joining. Initially, what I would like to do is acknowledge that we are on, we're doing this virtually, but we're on the lands of the traditional Cartonians of the land in which this online session is hosted. For me, it's the Gadigal people in Sydney, and the traditional custodians of the land where you as participants and our speakers are located. We would like to pay our respects to elders past, present and future. So we have a packed agenda today, as we often do with these webinars. So we will be asking you to participate in a poll that will really help us set up, and we'd like some engagement. So please do participate in our poll if you get your mobile phone ready. And also, if you've got some questions, we would appreciate them in the chat, so we can ask them at the end or along the way we get time. We will be talking about Microsoft Teams. We will have some insights from experts. We've got a few experts on the panel, but certainly from my colleague Jack Hendy at Engage Squared. We're also going to get some real life high performing teams insights from Andrew, and we're going to discuss that whole channels versus chat scenarios, and there'll be plenty of times for questions at the end. We will go out of the session at the end to, if you want to keep the conversation going, we'll give you a link so you can join us at the end, which has worked well in the past. So so don't feel you have to leave. When the webinar finishes, we'll invite you to carry on the chat with our expert panel. So today, thank you, Andrew, for joining. I noticed you've grown a beard during lockdown. Jack, good to see you. Laurie has always run some fantastic sessions for us with our business user groups, and we always appreciate your insights. And Sharon, also from SWOOP Analytics, good to have you on board. At this point, I will hand over to Emily to kick things off.
Thanks, Mark. So as we mentioned before, we would like to get you all warmed up with a bit of an interactive poll. On the screen here, there's a QR code. This will be the easiest way to head to Menti to participate. So if you just use your mobile device, hold up to the screen and follow the QR code. Alternatively, you can head to menti.com and it will prompt you to enter a code, and that code is on the screen there. So if you can just grab your phones out now, and we'll get the poll started in just a moment. Oh, I can see that we already have some answers coming through on my end. So we actually asked some similar polling questions through the SWOOP LinkedIn page very recently. So it'll be interesting to see how the results reflect for the attendees who are here today. I can see that there are a lot of results coming through for chat versus over email, which seems to be quite consistent with what we saw in our benchmarking study. And recently, actually, Laurie, who will just be talking in just a moment, is actually going to be, he actually published an article, and it's about the movement from conversation from email and how that's definitely being filtered into chat. But is that necessarily a good thing, or is it more of a bad thing? So we'll definitely be deep diving into that more today. So the results that we're seeing here definitely consistent with the polls that we've ran on LinkedIn, and also with our benchmarking insights as well. We have another question to get you warmed up as well. Where do you mostly work on Microsoft Teams at the moment? Again, we have asked this question on LinkedIn. I think on LinkedIn, we found that our results were mostly skewed towards chat and meetings. We're seeing some results come through for channel collaboration, which is great to see. But we're hoping after today that we'll see some more, or you'll start thinking a little bit more about collaborating in channels for more of those quality teamwork focused collaboration. So there's a lot happening in meetings at the moment, but how can we potentially look at working in more asynchronously to get work done? So we're hoping to give you a few ideas about how that will all work today. But from here, I'm going to actually hand over to Laurie to talk through some of the insights that we had around the use of chat and channels from our benchmarking study recently. So I'll hand over to you now, Laurie.
Thanks, Emily. Well, I guess the poll was about, do you use email or chat internally? And clearly the poll of this audience is basically saying it's chat. We certainly found that with our benchmarking study. We analysed something like nearly 100,000 teams across 33 organisations, and SWOOP style benchmarking is actually looking at what people do. So we don't so much survey people, but we measure what you're actually doing. And a lot of people did tell us that they were seeing their email rate go down, and of course the chat was actually going up quite a lot. So the clear assumption was that chat was replacing email, at least for internal communication. So and of course we measured, how did that compare with messages in channels, which is basically the topic of this webinar. And we found that on average, we make 28 times as many chat messages as channel messages. Now that might sound a shockingly high number. It might be small, you might think. I think for me, it wasn't so much how many more chat messages we sent. But in essence, it was really in the move to work from home that people were simply using what I would call the prior Skype for Business functions of chat, calls, and meetings. Right. So I guess what surprised us was that many of the people that were migrating to working from home and adopting Microsoft Teams were simply using what was Skype for Business, but inside Teams. And I guess that was more of the surprise than actually the multiple here. So if we move on, and when we looked at the chat, we found that 98% of the chats were what we're saying. Well, 98% of the chats were one-on-one, right? So they were just like a telephone call in the old days. Only 2% had more than 2 people in the chat. Now, this is a little disturbing. So if you think about emails being replaced by chat, I mean, I think if you looked at your emails, you probably didn't have 98% of your emails weren't one-on-one, right? So what we're swapping is one mode of interaction where likely we were emailing more than one person to a mode of interaction where it was mostly one-on-one. And that's a little bit disturbing, because in terms of sharing knowledge across an organisation, we've gone from something that may have been a little bit slower and more awkward to something that was faster and more fast-paced, but in essence we're actually limiting the actual spread of information and knowledge. Now, so when we look at it's not like that people didn't use Teams, right? So people did create Teams, but what we found was that 97% of those teams weren't using anything like the full potential of Teams, right? So there was an awful lot of dead teams, what we'd say, teams that have been started and never really progressed anywhere. And when I thought about that, I must admit, when we originally started using the Teams product, we thought, well, it's called Teams, so people would probably form teams, wouldn't they? In fact, what we're finding is that people are forming teams, but not knowing actually what to do with them once they've formed them. Right, so we often think about teams at work, and typically we think about our organisational structures and what I would call our business as usual teams. So you might be sitting in a team that's inside a hierarchical structure in your organisation, and that's your team. But is it the same team that you create on Microsoft Teams? I would argue that probably should be, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that people are creating teams as groups. They vary in size and use. Our report, our benchmarking report, has a fairly strong position on what a good team should look like, and it should be smaller, 4 to 8 people or something like that. We saw many teams with tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of people in them, and really, we think that's a misuse of the actual of the product. But nevertheless, that's not what we're here to talk about. So, and finally, I said, well, what we did do though is that based on the teams that were actual, digital teams on Teams, we looked at. So we looked at nearly 100,000 to start with. We reduced that down to what we called an elite set of less than 300. So we're pretty confident that those 300 were probably doing some pretty good things. We went and found out which organisations had the most teams in this top. It was 273 in fact, and then we went out and actually contacted them, because we in SWOOP, when we do our benchmarking, it's anonymous, right? So we don't have people's names, we don't have team names. All we've got is the organisation, so we can find out which organisation owns these teams. And then we went to those teams and those organisations, we gave them the ID numbers and we said, can you tell us what these teams were doing? And more often than not, we found that our contacts didn't really know what those teams were, but they were able to facilitate a connection to them, so that Sharon actually talked and interviewed them. We actually extracted these stories, and those are the stories that you will find in the benchmarking report, and they are really energizing. So if you want to see stories about digital transformation, about what teams are really doing productively, these were the ones, these are the stories, and that really energized us, and sort of saying, well, if all teams could work this way, if only all teams could work this way, and it's only, I'm saying we're only talking about 2 or 3% of the teams that are actually formed, how big a change could that make to an organisation? So I think I'll leave my part here over to Jack, because Jack actually works in the field, unlike me, who just crunches numbers. He actually talks to real people and customers. So let me hand over to Jack, and he'll give you a little bit more insight in this chat versus channel sort of debate.
Thanks very much, Laurie. Hey everybody, my name's Jack Hendy, and as Laurie said, I am a consultant working in the field within the change and adoption function at Engage Squared, and I'm originally from the UK, if you can discern my accent. I must say, just sort of following on, I'm not surprised really that there is an over-reliance on chat. I think from what I've seen, definitely after that burst of organic adoption of Teams following the pandemic, everybody's using the platform, but not necessarily in the right way. So, having helped lots of different organizations and audiences to adopt Teams, there are recurring trends that we keep seeing across the board where Teams is underutilized. And really the true ethos and real power of Teams comes with that working out loud. But we see resistance from people working in private siloed spaces like chat and like email. So today I want to cover some of the worst practices and some of the best practices around how you can more effectively work together with your teams and ultimately start to work in channels rather than chats. And it's easier said than done, and even working at a Microsoft Gold Partner consultancy, and we live and breathe all of the products, even we need to be reminded and nudged into some of those best practices. So it is hard, but hopefully I can give you some tools today so you can start working more collaboratively and more transparently. And I'd like to start on the why, because I think it's important that we can articulate the why to actually help define some of the remedies and best practices moving forward. So why do people overuse chat? Well, it's familiar. Instant messaging has been around for a very long time. We mentioned Communicator, Skype for Business, instant messaging just previously. We instant message a lot on consumer apps, some of that shadow IT. WhatsApp is used a lot by lots of different people around the world. And people understand chat, they're comfortable with it. It's familiar, and familiarity breeds inertia, and it creates an emotional attachment that can be very hard to change. They're also private in their nature, and they require explicit permission to be granted, and therefore you can control that environment. And any exposure, you can control any exposure to that content, creating that psychological safety, which we've seen, and it's very similar to emails over the years. I think at the root cause, there's an inherent fear of people being judged by the things that they write and the things that they share in open forums. Digital workplaces and platforms and working out loud concepts and behaviours are still relatively new to many people. And so in many cases, people are undereducated in some of those best practices and what good actually looks like. So I think these three elements encapsulate quite neatly why people use chat. If we can move on to the next slide, I'll talk shortly about why chat is bad for work. So you might think, you're chatting a lot, it's not hurting anyone, I'm talking to colleagues, I'm getting work done, what's the big deal? Well, chat is bad for work. And when I say work, I mean any deliverable or outcome that you're responsible for in your role. So firstly, it's pretty chaotic working in chats, very disorderly. Your left-hand column can get filled up very quickly with a number of sort of competing demands and notifications. Terrible for prioritizing and managing workloads. It could be very hard to find again, and private chats and group chats and meeting chats can be hard to track who has said what and where. They're restricted spaces, they're private, meaning if you have those project conversations in a chat with only a few team members, and it was a really revealing statistic actually that the 98% of chats only have 2 people in. So how many times are you duplicating those conversations with other team members, or worse, completely leaving them out of the loop so they never know what was said? This fosters exclusion and fragmented team cultures, which can lead to larger negative effects, especially in our current climate. Stifling, it suppresses information and causes frustration, not only with messages and conversations, but also with documents. And I think that document management best practices is a whole nother webinar, but I think that it's really important when we're thinking about sharing documents in chat, because they're saved in OneDrive, which is a private and personal space, again requiring explicit permissions. So I think that in summary, it's a really bad place to get things done and to be working as a team. So the power of channels, how can we unlock some of the power for your teamwork using channels, and some of the benefits of using channels? So they're logical. They're essentially topics or work streams that are easily categorized workloads that you can find quickly and logically. They provide a tailored workspace with a dedicated file repository and tool set that can be customized for your needs. You can prioritize your workspace. You can cut through the noise and the distractions that you're hit with all the time when you're working in this space. What the platform does is it empowers you to take control of your workload, so you can prioritize the most important parts by hiding, pinning, or leaving irrelevant teams, and then configuring those notifications so you can create your optimal workspace. We mentioned asynchronous working just previously. And with the advent of working from home, it's more important than ever where you can pick up where you left off, wherever you're based and whatever the time. That passive knowledge acquisition is really powerful, and the benefit of working out loud is massive, but might not always be obvious. Working in channels helps to facilitate that passive knowledge transfer. And what we mean by that is actually acquiring knowledge that you didn't know that you needed, or maybe you wouldn't have immediately reached out for, which again can improve that culture and connectedness, but also improve decision making and problem solving. And finally, on the power of channels, context. Context is everything. It's so important, not only to your current team members, but for future ones, the sick ones, for those lucky enough to be on annual leave somewhere holidaying, although it's seldom these days in most parts of the world. Teams channels provides an unbroken history and reference point for all deliverables and approvals, issues, decisions of a project or a functional team, which is invaluable information for team members to quickly upskill and to get to grips with the nuances of that team, which might be missed in documents or just meetings alone. So hopefully I've convinced you that channels are extremely powerful for your team and for your organization. And I'd love to leave you with some best practices and some tips to try and stimulate that working out loud within your team. So don't overcomplicate it. Allow for that organic growth of a team. When I see teams being implemented into organizations, there's a tendency to overcomplicate and to sort of almost predefine at the start all the different channels that need to be created. And you can actually perplex and confuse end users if you create 10 channels with all different topics, and where do I post what and where, and you're exacerbating the problem. So let a team grow organically and add a channel when you need to or when it's logical to. Get that management and leadership buy-in to create that psychological safety for your team, so everybody can share things and so they don't feel like they're going to be judged. Define how you will work together as a team. So create those house rules, where to post, where to save documents. Some of the features like at mentioning or appropriately putting a header on a post can be really important. And essentially, it only works when everyone works together. If you have a few dissenters or a few people talking in one place and saving things in another, it can cause friction. Encourage colleagues. Everybody needs a nudge every now and again. So suggest, if you're having a very long chat or you're having a meeting or maybe it's an email, suggest to your colleagues maybe to take it to Teams. And there's some tools now within the Teams platform like Share to Teams in email, where you can actually move that conversation across and have that conversation in that open and transparent place where it's going to be a benefit for everybody. And finally, if you are having those meetings or really long chat exchanges, follow the high level summary with a post in the channel for everybody's benefit. And again, for those absent team members or those future team members, so they can really quickly get up to speed. So that concludes my segment. I will hand over to Sharon to take over. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jack. And thank you to everybody for all these great questions that are coming in. So we will answer all those questions and get to those. But firstly, well, actually, Jack, I also want to give you guys a little bit of credit, because Jack is actually speaking from experience about working in channels. So they really do practice what they preach at Engage Squared. In our benchmarking of 100,000 teams, Engage Squared had 7 teams in the top 3%, and one of those I think was in the top 15. And Engage Squared is also Microsoft's Partner of the Year for 2021. So thank you for joining us on this webinar. So Laurie earlier on explained how people are using chat and channels in Teams, and now Jack's explained why you should be using channels instead of chat in Teams. But what we want to do now is actually show you what it looks like on a day-to-day basis, how it works in real life. So I'm joined to and Andrew is RACQ's Internal Communications Advisor. For anyone who doesn't live in Queensland, RACQ is the equivalent of the NRMA in New South Wales and the ACT, or I think in Victoria, am I right, it's the RACV. Yes, thumbs up. So when we benchmarked almost 100,000 teams as part of SWOOP's 2021 Microsoft Teams benchmarking, RACQ had 14 teams in the top 3%. So they were, I think, about in our top 5 international organisations. So RACQ also had a team ranked number 7 in the world, and there were 2 more in the top 50. So Andrew has very kindly offered to screen share his real life Microsoft Teams team and walk you through what it looks like to work out loud in Teams. So I think that's Andrew's just about to share that screen. And Andrew, can you explain what this team does, the one that you're going to share with us? And could you also please walk us through what it's like to work in Teams on a day-to-day basis, what it looks like?
Sure. Hi, Sharon, and thanks for the opportunity to have a bit of a chat to everyone today. This is actually my team. This is our internal communications team that I thought I would just show you through briefly. It's not a particularly large team. There's actually only 4 of us who actually comprise this team. But from what Laurie and I've talked about previously, teams of that size probably work quite effectively in the Teams environment anyway. I have to say though, I am, and Sharon, we've talked about this before, quite surprised, to be honest, that we have quite so many teams doing so well, because to be honest, we only really started doing what seemed logical to us. I suppose 18 months or so ago, when all of a sudden all of us started working from home. So it's nice to be acknowledged for doing the right thing, but I feel sometimes that it's probably coincidental rather than necessarily by design. So this team in particular, as I said, is our internal communications team. So this channel, we share a whole variety of conversations within the team. We talk about production of e-communication tools that we share group-wide, which I'll share a little bit more about in a moment. We co-author documents and what have you as well. And it's just a very easy space for us to use. The thing I just realised I forgot to mention is that I have been with RACQ for nearly 5 years, but the rest of our team are comparatively new. One about 18 months, one about 3 months, and one only 6 weeks or so. And what's been hugely helpful, I think, for them, and I hope not too condescending from me, but I've had a lot of institutional knowledge that I've been able to bring to conversations. Jack mentioned earlier working out loud. It's a huge part of how we operate at RACQ. I'm the Yammer community manager as well, but working out loud is particularly important, I think, in this instance, because it gives me the opportunity to chime in and add to conversations with our new people. If they're unaware of things, I can always contribute in a way that hopefully is helpful to them as well. So,
Andrew, sorry, can I just butt in there? So when you're talking about new people too, I guess for onboarding for employees, all that information is now there in these threaded conversations I can see. So if you do have a new employee, I guess it's much easier for them to get up to speed very quickly. Whereas if all of this was done in chat, they'd have no access to it.
Oh, definitely. And we actively encourage them to do that. While everybody is always very willing to help new people on board, oftentimes it's a little bit of a case of, well, why don't you do a bit of an explore first, see what you can find. Chances are you'll be able to answer some of those questions. And we find that it's an easier way to have them feel comfortable with the environment and just be more confident in, I guess, self-serving some of that information themselves as well. So what I thought I might show you as well is, as I mentioned, we often use this channel for conversations about e-communications. if I just skip over to the files section for a moment and go to what we call Info Bytes, which is our group e-newsletter, how we use this on a fortnightly basis is we will co-author a document containing all of the bits and pieces for that edition. So different people from the team contribute different portions of this content. It's all edited. It's an opportunity for us to all say, oh, that's a really interesting thing. Perhaps you might like to incorporate this bit too, because we work with individual clients and not everybody's across everything that is going on. So we'll put this document together and it becomes the source of truth from which the e-newsletter is constructed in another tool. We have all of the files relating to images and what have you in here. So that's one example, but we all work collectively across a variety of projects. And it is extremely valuable to have the document in one place. We can see changes being made together. Sometimes we will actually have a conversation via a meeting and we'll actually make live changes in those publications or documents as well.
Interesting that you say that, Andrew, because that was one of the other findings we spoke in the benchmarking report to lots of our partners, including Mark and others from Engage Squared. And one of the keys, the tips that they were saying was, when you're having your meetings on Teams, actually work in those meetings. So exactly what you're talking about, perhaps have your meeting within the channel and then your documents are in that channel and you're working on those documents in the meeting. So when the meeting's finished, you've actually got work that you could measure. Is that how you guys work?
Definitely, yeah. And you'll almost end up with, I guess, a bit of a transcript of the meeting as well, and you can see those outcomes at the end of it. So sometimes people will chime in with just a comment in the chat as well as while we're actually speaking as well, because there's a lot happening sometimes and a lot of people wanting to get their opinions across. So yeah, it's proven very useful in that context as well.
And I can really see you're using Teams as the hub, which is the idea. Jack can always jump in here. I'm sure he'll agree with this, but it is the idea of using Teams as a hub. So you're using all your other Microsoft apps in there, your documents and file sharing within the one place, which is quite interesting. Yeah. And when you showed us initially to Andrew, just for those who maybe aren't using channels the way that you, as you said, for you it's just second nature, but a lot of people aren't in this position. There's lots of threaded conversations there. So just on a day-to-day basis, like say you had something new you're working on, how would you start that piece of work?
Well, I guess it can be a little bit dependent. If it is quite a specific project, we do have individual channels for those conversations as well. Oftentimes they will start in, I guess this is our general channel, and then potentially spin out to a channel specifically about a project if that's more appropriate. And sometimes it will start with all four of us contributing to it, but it might end up being something that perhaps only a couple of the members of the team need to work on, or they might go and create a team with one of the clients that they're working with and run it through a channel in that way. This is often the genesis point, this particular channel, but it's certainly only one of a number that we use.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw some earlier on, there were some questions in the chat about feeling, maybe people are using chat rather than channels because they feel safer working within chat. Now you're saying it's a team of 4 and you're not using chat. Can you explain about this feeling of safety and psychological safety that you don't need to work in chat? You can actually work in channels if that team feels safe to work in those channels, psychologically safe.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I do acknowledge that this is a comparatively small team. It obviously perhaps becomes a little bit more confronting as the teams grow in size and maybe you don't have the close personal relationships. But I think what I would say is, if we cast our minds back 18 months or so ago, when we were all working in the office and we were having conversations with people, there was often a casualness and a relaxedness that I think has been lost a little bit early as we migrated to using Teams a lot more. But I think people are starting to increasingly recognise that this is the future and we can have conversations in the same way that we did before, that there is nothing to be worried about with making a slight mistake or perhaps not representing yourself exactly as you would like to, because it's human nature. You don't get it 100% right all of the time. And we really encourage people to say what they're thinking, rather than be spending too much time trying to frame it in a certain way and redrafting a comment 3 times before they share it in a channel.
Yeah. Oh, there's a question that came in here, and I'm going to start with asking you about it, Andrew. Is it normal, and it'd just be interesting in such a big organisation, because how many employees do you have at RACQ?
A little over 3,000, so not
Yeah.
huge, but we're getting up there.
Yeah, so the question is it normal to have your IT department control creation of channels, or is it possible to just have any user create a channel and allocate members? How's it work at RACQ?
No, we certainly, our technology team do take some interest from time to time, but absolutely we have the independence to be able to create new channels, to add members, to build all of that ourselves. There's a level of autonomy that thankfully they trust us to all have ourselves.
Yeah, and Mark or Jack, is that best practice?
Yeah, well, look, there's a couple of ways, and it depends on what sort of the culture of the organisation is. There's sort of 3 distinct approaches you can take, which is, first one's free for all. So anyone can create anything, any team. And I've seen it work at large organisations well, because you can sort of circumnavigate that red tape. Second is sort of that automated creation process. So there's a quick automation. There'll be a script that checks if there's another team called the same thing. It will do some smarts, and then it will either approve or deny your team creation. Or it's request only, so it's it's properly locked down. So you have those three approaches, and it really depends on the culture and the objectives of the teams and the organisation.
Great. Well, when we have if anyone's free and wants to delve into this a little bit deeper, we can talk in our post-webinar catch-up if anyone would like more information about that. So, Andrew, can you tell me when you do use chat? Like, when is it the right time to use chat? And actually, you said that you also look after Yammer. When would you transition some conversations to Yammer as well? I'd love to know that.
Yeah, well, I guess, to be honest, for my own team, for chat, it really is just about personal stuff. Like, I need to take this Friday off. That sort of thing is typically where those conversations happen. In parts of the business, I suppose there's probably a little bit more than that. But I guess in any of my interactions with people, when I'm just working with them in teams, I will always encourage them, look, let's take this outside of an individual chat. There's the potential for more people to participate in this conversation. Let's create a channel and have the conversation there.
Yep.
As to when we would move stuff to Yammer, I think oftentimes project pieces of work start in teams in a channel, and some of the project work is done there. But if it's something that we then want to socialise with the group widely and get interaction from a whole lot of people, we'll move it then into Yammer and start the actual sharing of assets, creating interactive conversations, possibly even having Yam Jams and what have you within Yammer.
Yeah. I'd love to talk to you more about Yammer when we've got more time as well. There's a question here from Susie, Andrew. Can you have a DSU from your teams? I don't know what a DSU is.
I don't know what a DSU
Can
is.
you just, Susie, can you just tell us what the acronym stands for, please? And we'll get Andrew to answer that. But in the meantime, well, it's all well and good to assume that Andrew's team is a high-performing team, but how do you know for sure? How can you see if everyone's connecting and collaborating, or can you see if there's gaps in communication? And that's where SWOOP comes into play. So Andrew, again, very generously, is going to share his SWOOP for Teams dashboard for this team, the one that we've just been looking at. And Emily's going to jump in here and talk you through what measures to follow, just so it's really easy for you to be able to see what is a high performing team, or what do you need to improve, how do you need to nudge people to get to these high performing teams.
Awesome. Thanks, Sharon, and thanks, Andrew, for sharing. So in just a moment, you're going to see the SWOOP for Teams dashboard for the exact team that Andrew was just talking to. So up on the screen in just a second, we'll see here, so this is for the internal communications team, of course, and we know that this is a high performing team, as we spoke about before, and there are a few key indicators that I think really sort of reiterate that finding that we had from our benchmarking study. So over on the right-hand side, you'll see the team, SWOOP the team persona. And we have 5 different personas that we look at. We can see here for Andrew's internal communications team that they've been identified as a self-directed team. And self-directed teams are definitely the most aspirational team type you can be. We have a handful of other teams as well. But if you are logging into SWOOP for Teams and you are seeing that the teams that you are a part of and that you are working in and making the most out of channel collaboration, you should see self-directed teams being the team type within SWOOP. And just the measures that you see just below in the team persona part there as well around key player dependency sitting at 0%. For Andrew's team, there's not one single person who seems to be driving the majority of these conversations. Same goes with the percent core, 100% of the team. Every single team member seems to be connected. And that is also visualized there through the team network map that you see over there on the left-hand side. Everyone seems to be connected. And I know that Andrew also mentioned that this is a relatively small team, and that would definitely be lining up with best practice. At the moment, we know that there are 4 key members of the team. I know that SWOOP is mentioning there that there are 9 users. That's just looking at the number of users that have been around within the time period that we have selected at the moment. So while some of these team members do interchange, it seems as though they can still rely on the channel to get up to date on that information. If we scroll down just slightly as well, we'll see a few extra measures there that I would say are quite strong indicators of high performance and use of channels as well. Things like the curiosity index, for example, that is sitting quite high for this team, sitting at 28%. And this means that 28% of the conversations happening within Andrew's team, users are actually asking a question, which is a great way to stimulate further conversation, higher quality conversation, and is also an indicator of things like problem solving within the team and higher levels of innovation as well. Response rates there are also looking quite strong as well in terms of the number of posts that actually receive a response or that receive some type of reaction as well. And people seem to be quite agile in this space as well. So we can see that people are responding to messages quite swiftly as well. The last key call out that I'll have there is the mention index too, so sitting at 25%. And using the mentions and tagging of your other team members in the right circumstances, you definitely don't want to go overboard with the app mentioning, because we know that can, probably get to a sense where there's a bit of overload and you could potentially switch off. I feel like this team is sitting at a nice sweet spot at the moment. So app mentioning people and tagging people into the relevant conversations as well. So it's great to see how this can be visualized and how it can come to life with what Andrew's team is doing within Teams and what it looks like in SWOOP as well. Sharon, do you have anything else to add off the back of this or any extra questions for Andrew?
Yes, we've got lots of questions coming through. Liv had a couple of questions. Can you expand a bit on bigger teams versus smaller teams? Actually, we might wait for that one towards the end and we'll get Jack and Laurie to talk about that. But Andrew, what's been your biggest challenge getting people from chat to channels or from email into channels?
Oh, that's a good question. It's probably, I can't think of one clear example where that's been really a challenge. I guess we've had a new group CEO join us in the last 12 months, and we have seen, as a consequence, as is often the case, some new senior leaders coming into the organisation as well. Some of them have come at a time where they brought some knowledge and experience in using Teams, but others have come from a place completely cold and have never had any exposure to Teams before. So perhaps the best example that I can really give, I suppose, is helping them and educating them and getting them comfortable with using Teams when it's not been a space they've had a lot of familiarity with in the past.
Yeah, well, let's expand on that a little bit later. And Emily's got some more, sort of a quiz, a bit of a test for everybody, and then we'll open up to some more of these questions because there's some great questions coming in here. Emily, I'm going to hand back over to you for our little quiz to see if everybody's been listening in.
Yes, thanks, Sharon, and thanks again, Andrew, for sharing some of those insights. You'll be heading just to the same Menti access link as before. So again, if you've switched off your phone, or if you've been really engaged in our content today, pick up your device again, use the QR code and jump back into Menti, or use the code that's on the screen there. So I'll give you all just a moment to jump in for a few scenarios. So for this next lot of questions, what I want you to do is think about where these conversations should be happening within Microsoft Teams. So the first scenario that we have is around sharing agenda items in advance of a team meeting. And I think we may have even maybe touched on this example in a way. So we can see some of the results coming in where this would happen. And I can also appreciate that some people will probably be quite honest in their answers here. So I understand for some organisations, maybe you still are sharing agenda items via email. For some of you, you might still be sharing it via chat. Best practice in this situation, I would definitely say sharing within the channel in advance of a meeting is definitely probably the right way to go. And we can definitely see that's reflected in some of the answers that are coming through at the moment. We can see channels are being quite well reflected. Still some people operating in email and chat for this purpose, but I guess it all depends on the context. But hopefully this will give you, encourage you to think about where these types of conversations might happen even directly after this session today as well. The next scenario we have is around, say if you're planning a company all hands meeting and you need to have that first initial discussion around how that's going to be executed. How would you have those conversations? You can be honest, of course. Maybe you're thinking about this from the lens of best practice, which is also okay. Where would you have initial planning conversations to execute a company all hands meeting? We can see for some of the results coming through, we see that channels are very well reflected again, and meetings seem to be coming in as a close second. I guess, again, this sort of depends on what the planning process might look like within your organisation. I'd say that channels would probably be a really great place to start. If you're wanting to have this as more of an asynchronous discussion, are there things that you can cover off first off before jumping into a meeting and having those as a more in-depth discussion? So meetings and channels, I think, would be a really great place to start. For those who are having those conversations in chats or via YAML or an ESN or via email, maybe there are ways that you can sort of channel those conversations into channels or potentially a meeting as well if you want to go a little bit more in depth. And the final scenario that we have is around asking your colleague what time they're going for a coffee run this afternoon. And I can completely appreciate that there's probably a very low percentage of people on this call that they're actually going to be sitting in an office and going for a coffee with a colleague at the moment. So maybe checking in to see when you're taking a lunch break or something like that. Where would you have this conversation? And I think this is definitely drawing back to what we were talking about at the very start around chat being dedicated to those more personal one-on-one conversations where it's not necessarily related to anything more project focused or work focused. It's something that you can quickly check in with a colleague and get an answer back relatively quickly as well. So great to see that most people would be having this type of conversation via chat. I think that one's a pretty straightforward one. At this point, I'm just going to jump back into our slides. And I just wanted to run through a very quick summary and a few quick takeaways around this whole chat versus channel debate, best and worst practices, kind of drawing back to some of the things that Laurie had spoken about. Also, what Jack mentioned around some of the best practices and tips as well. And even taking into account some of those sort of more real life examples and how that worked with Andrew and his team at RACQ. So first and foremost, I would definitely recommend that you're working out loud in Teams channels and just to reserve chat for those more personal messages, exactly like the last scenario that we looked at around asking your colleague what time they're going for a coffee. Reconsider the purpose of recurring meetings. Now, I know that you probably have a lot of these recurring meetings sitting in your diary. What are some ways that you could potentially collaborate asynchronously, potentially through channels, or what we would recommend to be through channels, to maybe take some of those more recurring meetings out of your diary? When can you actually dedicate the time to have more in-depth discussion? So just another consideration. Put agenda meeting items in Teams channels and work on them asynchronously. Again, back to one of the scenarios, so I hope we're all across that now. Take time to decide how your team will operate, what it will look like, and what you want to achieve. So this really is coming back to that shared purpose and agreeing on exactly what that team is going to operate for. Don't turn off Teams functionality. This is probably more so a note to IT teams to keep everything as open as possible, so that your employees can take advantage of these more collaborative functionalities as a part of Teams. And also focus on learning digital team skills rather than necessarily going into technical training on how to use Teams. So this is more so about, similar to how we looked at the SWOOP for Teams dashboard today. All of the measures that you see in SWOOP are really centered around collaboration and how you could work as a high-performing team. So thinking about it from that lens, as opposed to knowing about how everything operates within Teams, is definitely the way to go. If you did want to deep dive into some more of these best and worst practices, we have a heap more in the benchmarking report as well. I know that will be linked in just a moment in the slides, but I'm sure you'll also be able to find a link within the Q&A too. Sharon, do we have any other questions that have popped up in the Q&A? Actually, it might be a good time just to wrap up and see if we have anything else to cover off.
Lots more questions, Emily. So I think I might direct this question to Laurie for starters, and then Jack, please feel free to jump in, because Laurie can actually share the data on this question. It's from Brett, and he says, what are your thoughts on this? You're an active member of a Microsoft team, but often feel that your posts to channels aren't getting enough response or encouragement or engagement. So then you begin using chat more. Laurie, how do you get around that? How do you get people into channels and away from chat?
Well, I think firstly you've got to look at the team itself, and how big is it and what is it doing. So what we see in the benchmarking is that the high performing teams are generally small. So it's rare that we see teams bigger than 10. So if you're sitting in a team that's got 30 or 40 people, then there's plenty of people to ignore you, if you like. So somebody else will pick that up. But when you're sitting in a team like Andrew's, 4 or 5, and there's no response, then it's pretty clear to team members that somebody's been left on the limb. So that one in particular, I think, when you look at the sort of team that you're in. Also, if you are in a channel and you are specifically looking for some feedback, using the mention, does have an impact, right? So if you pick somebody out of your team, they know that they've been selected to respond. When you're in a team that's fairly big, everyone thinks that somebody else is going to respond, and then nobody responds. So I guess, Jack, you've probably got some other responses that you could add.
Yeah, definitely. I think what I'd probably add is, what are you posting and where? And maybe there's another platform for that post, whatever it is. We talk about teams, we talk about channels within teams as facilitating high velocity teamwork. And I think we could use channels and teams for an array of different scenarios. And sometimes that scenario tips over to almost another product, like a Yammer or a social enterprise network. So I'd look at sort of what you're posting and where, and maybe if there's another tool, and as Laurie said, utilizing some of those features within the Teams platform.
Great. Jack, another question while we're still on screen with you. Somebody has asked that they've commented that they think people are more afraid of moving from email because it's easy to search and have a record on email, whereas discussions and related documents can be found. So again, well, I guess using channels would get around that, but can you touch on the search in email, chat and channels, please?
Yeah, for sure. I think that within the M365 suite, search is extremely powerful, and they're only improving the search capabilities. So actually, if you start working within Teams, start working out loud, you'll be surprised of how accurate the search results are within Teams. So I definitely promote the use of search within Teams. It is very powerful. But yeah, you know, email as a siloed communication channel is it's hard to move across, but definitely utilize the search within M365 and Teams because it's very powerful.
Yeah, and Jack, just one more, and then I have actually shared in the chat the link to it's just a regular Teams meeting. If anyone wants to just follow up with some more questions one-on-one to our speakers, we've just got 15 minutes put aside, jump in there and you can just ask directly. But Jack, just this question, we're a very large organisation with lots of different organisational units. I've recently been joined to about a dozen teams, each using different channels for specific information. I'm getting lost in following them all, keeping track of notifications and just cutting through the noise. I think this is so relevant to so many people. How do you cut through the noise?
Yeah, sure. It's really tough. I mentioned it in my segment, that prioritization. So there are a number of features within the Teams platform where you can prioritize specific channels or whole teams, and also demote channels and hide teams, so you can try and surface to the top what is most important to you. Configuring those notifications is really key as well, and you know, being able to curate your own workspace is very powerful. So look into those features. It would be my recommendation.
Jack, we've got lots more questions. There's some really good ones coming in that I really want to deal with, but let's just very quickly go through these slides. If we end up with a minute or two at the end, we'll ask these final questions. Otherwise, please jump in to the next meeting and we'll ask them all and answer them.
Sure thing. So we'd be very keen to discuss with you outside of this live event in a free discovery workshop to assess your team's environment and provide some recommendations for you and the next steps for your digital workplace journey. So drop us an email, scan the QR code, and there's the email address there. There's just a really quick story regarding a customer I want to mention. We recently helped Bupa Australia transform over to Teams last year, and the value of Teams can really be shown in a very succinct story where there was a whole program, a large transformational program with 60 projects collaborating with various different teams across the organization, and they were using email and they were using meetings. When they started using Teams, they managed to halve their Teams meetings. So it went from 60 minutes to 30, and they saved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours over the course of the project. So really quick wins and really quick benefits from utilising channels and teams.
Awesome, thanks, Jack. And just a few quick actions here. If you were interested in having a look to see how your channels are performing in Microsoft Teams, SWOOP Analytics does also offer free trials of SWOOP for Teams. It's really easy to set up, and the best way to get all of that kick-started is just to reach out to myself. I've got my email on the screen there, or you can use the QR code, which will give you a little bit more information on our website, and an additional contact form there as well. And then, of course, a lot of the insights that we have talked to today as well, especially on the SWOOP side, has all been from our 2021 Microsoft Teams benchmarking report. If you haven't had a chance to check this out just yet, would strongly recommend having that downloaded, so you can use the QR code there to access that again. And then if we have any other questions off the back of today, I know we had quite a few in the Q&A that we haven't quite gotten to answering. Please join us right now. We have a link to a team meeting in the Q&A right now. So if you meet us over there, we'd be happy to talk in more depth about some of those questions that you have. So thank you very much for joining us today. We've gone through a heap of content and we've already answered a heap of your questions already. So we'll see you over in the Teams meeting in just a moment.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.